Between 1960 and 1967, the California prison system became aware of the Mexican enemy's criminal activity, broke the group up and relocated them to different prisons. Active recruitment continued by the Mexican Mafia, as they are now called, and the gang basically took control of the California prisons. For me, on this rainy day, it took the form of a dozen sullen Hispanic gangbangers glowering back at me while I snapped their pictures. It was certain one of them had punched that shank into Martinez's neck, but I knew that none of them would ever tell who. Cooperative witnesses didn't come to Pelican Bay. I examined all their hands and arms for a trace of blood or cuts, but saw nothing suggestive. Then I called over the yard officers to help with the strip search. The strip search is a prison ceremony that makes everyone queasy. Guards and prisoners alike consider it degrading, disgusting, and shameful, making it the perfect ritual to symbolize the vulgar intimacy of prison life. When a prisoner bends over and spreads his cheeks, he is more naked but no less embarrassed than the officer required to peer up his rectum. But the range of articles that criminals have managed to conceal in their anal cavity has astounded medical professionals for years. So good law enforcement makes the inspection necessary. That 6-inch piece of sharpened metal sticking from Martinez's neck was less than an hour ago hidden up one of these inmates' rectums. Unfortunately, it was my job to search them for clues. In the pouring rain and winter cold, a dozen inmates were ordered to strip to their boxer shorts. Then, one at a time, they quickly dropped drawers, bent over, and spread their cheeks. Most had done it so often, it became a practiced single motion. At this time, however, because this was more than a routine search, an embellishment was added. They had to squat and cough simultaneously, inducing a burp that can dislodge objects inserted too deeply to see otherwise. No incriminating evidence was discovered by this exercise, although a lurid gallery of body art was put on display when the men stripped down. The same impulse that drives young wannabe gangsters to spray paint the walls of their neighborhoods inspires them as adults to cover their bodies with intricate, fantastic tattoos. The tats proclaim their allegiance to their neighborhood gang. All of them on the basketball court wore elaborate representations of the number 13 and the letter M, the 13th letter, which marked them as belonging to La M, the Mexican Mafia, the oldest prison gang in America and the most powerful. A radio check confirmed that inmate Martinez also had M tattoos, some faded enough to indicate long allegiance. He had been ambulanced to the small local hospital in Crescent City, where none of the doctors wanted a chance removing the shank from his neck either. Arrangements were made for a helicopter to fly him down the coast to the next larger hospital in Arcadia. The idea of the gang standing by while one of their own was attacked didn't shock any of the squad officers, but it definitely raised their interest in John Martinez, who must have seriously crossed someone important. The green light to stab another gang member could only come from high in the ranks, and would only have been decided after a consultation among the bosses. All of the known bosses, however, were in the isolation cells to prevent exactly that sort of communication. The picture became somewhat clearer that evening after the yard was released, when Gang Investigative Sergeant Craig Atwater pulled the jacket from inmate C99777. Martinez had been in prison for 10 years, but only transferred to Pelican Bay in October, 3 months ago. Prior to that, he was at Folsom Prison, the prison for old school convicts. Convicts of that era typically had to learn how to do their time quietly, without incident, and didn't always get along with the new breed of in-your-face gangsters. Friday morning, Sergeant Atwater spoke to his counterpart at Folsom, who told him that Martinez had indeed debriefed, the CDC term for becoming a snitch. Likely, he'd gotten on the wrong side of the gang honcho, or failed to follow an order, or simply tired of the gang life. Whatever the reason, he had told prison officials everything he knew about MA activities in Folsom. In return, he'd been promised a good word when he came up for parole and moved to Pelican Bay for his protection. This was terminal naivety all around, since the gang could play the system as well as the authorities with equal or better intelligence. but far more ruthless conviction. It had taken 3 months for the gang to discover Martinez's betrayals, decide his fate, track him down, and find somebody to stab him. Their determination to finish the job was made clear that afternoon when a Hispanic male called the warden's office claiming to be a member of Martinez's family and wanting to know what hospital he'd been moved to. Martinez's family, however, had not yet been notified that anything had happened to him. The gang knew more than they did. The ISU squad was on the road that night, and by dawn, Saturday, they were at Mad River Community Hospital in Arcadia to provide a roving patrol in case an MA hit team showed up from LA. The doctors there had finally managed to extract the shank, but Martinez slipped into a coma. When I took my turn watching over him, the man looked awful. His neck was dark purple and so swollen that the surgery staples were pulling loose. He died Sunday morning. Early the next week, I visited the cells occupied by the dozen inmates from the basketball court. I had the murder weapon with me, a 6-inch strip of steel band, less than an inch wide. It was probably thrown over the wall from the prison metal shop. It was sharpened to a blunt but effective point and had a scrap of white cotton t-shirt wrapped around it for a handle. I found what I was looking for in Housing Unit 3 of Cell Block B. On the gray cement wall behind the bolted down toilet in Cell B3110 were heavy scratch marks where someone had laboriously filed a piece of recent metal. What the fuck? On the gray cement wall behind the bolted down toilet in Cell B3110 were heavy scratch marks where someone had laboriously filed a piece of metal recently. The shank from Martinez's neck matched the scratches exactly. I snapped pictures and scraped metal flakes into a small plastic sample container for lab analysts, which I doubted would be necessary. One of the cell's 2 occupants was merely an accomplice who could be downgraded to a witness with some serious coaxing. Eventually he was. The cell's other occupant was inmate H47645, a 22-year-old gangbanger named Jaime Ponce, who was down for transport and possession of a controlled substance with intent to sell, a routine drug bust that bought him 5 years. Most short-timers his age would have been assigned to less formidable prison. Than Pelican Bay, but Ponce made the grade because he was a known active gang member. His standing in the Emmett, however, wasn't quite as glorious as the prosecutors thought. When he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, Ponce admitted that he'd been in the hat, in trouble with the gang, and killed Martinez to clear himself. He wouldn't say what the trouble was, but it gave the Emmett more leverage over him than the state of California could wield. At the time of the killing, he had only 2 more years to serve before being released. Instead, he would spend the rest of his days at Pelican Bay. It was a measure of the fear and control the gang enjoys inside the prison, where gang values rule and everyone's safety depends on abiding by them. Ponce and Martinez both knew those rules when they made their choices, and the brutal law of prison decided their fate. One was blood in for life, the other was blood out. The Emmett uses killings as a means of discipline or gaining respect. Emmett killings are extremely gruesome and calculated to establish fear and intimidation. The lesson wasn't lost for me. I collected evidence every day on the fatal consequence of snitching in prison. I never imagined that someday I'd be in the hat myself, forced to make those fearsome choices and tempt that same fate.